The history of the Samaritans. Who were they, and why were they rejected? For thousands of years, a small nation lived in the hills of the Holy Land, neither Jewish nor Gentile, bearing a unique and controversial identity, the Samaritans. They were guardians of ancient traditions and, at the same time, targets of deep disdain. Their story begins in the pages of the Old Testament and extends to encounters with Jesus, revealing a timeless message about prejudice, faith, and redemption. Let's explore who these mysterious Samaritans were and why their name became synonymous with rejection. The great king Solomon ruled Israel at the height of its power and prosperity. His kingdom extended throughout the Promised Land, uniting the 12 tribes under a single crown. Temples, palaces, and cities flourished. Trade brought riches from distant lands. It was the golden age of Israelite power, an era that many future generations would remember with longing. But even in these glorious days, hidden cracks were beginning to form. Solomon, despite all his wisdom, made serious mistakes. The Bible tells us in 1 Kings 11 verse 4 that as he grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and he was no longer fully devoted to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Taxes increased to finance grand projects, and forced labor was imposed, especially on the northern tribes. While Jerusalem and the tribe of Judah prospered, other regions began to feel the weight of royal demands. Long-standing tensions between the northern and southern tribes, present even before the monarchy, resurfaced under the guise of unity. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam assumed the throne. It was a decisive moment, an opportunity to ease tensions and unite the nation. But the opposite happened. In 1 Kings 12, we read how Rehoboam rejected the people's plea for fair taxation. When representatives of the northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, asked him to lighten the heavy yoke imposed by Solomon, Rehoboam first consulted the elders who had served his father. They advised wisdom and humility. If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them, and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. But Rehoboam chose to listen to the young men he had grown up with. They encouraged him to assert authority and dominance. So, when the people returned to hear his decision, Rehoboam arrogantly declared, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." This harsh and foolish response was the last straw. In response to his cruelty, 10 tribes revolted, as recorded in 1 Kings 12 verse 16. What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. In a single moment, the united kingdom of Israel, carefully built by David and Solomon, split into two. The 10 northern tribes rejected the house of David and formed their own kingdom, retaining the name Israel. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming the southern kingdom, called Judah. The northern kingdom initially made Shechem its capital, an ancient city with deep roots in Israel's history. Later, King Omri established a new capital called Samaria. As 1 Kings 16 verse 24 says, Omri bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver and built a city, naming it Samaria. The city, strategically built on a hill, was easy to defend and quickly became the political, economic, and religious center of the northern kingdom. Over time, the entire surrounding region came to be called Samaria, and its inhabitants Samaritans. Thus began the first chapter of the history of the Samaritans, born of a divided kingdom, a political wound never fully healed, and a new center of power that rivaled Jerusalem. From the beginning, the northern kingdom faced serious challenges. Jeroboam, its first king, had a practical concern. If the people continued to travel to Jerusalem for festivals and sacrifices at the temple, their loyalty might slowly return to the house of David. To prevent this, he made a decision that would forever change the religious course of the kingdom. In 1 Kings 12 verses 28 to 29, we read that after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." One was placed in Bethel and the other in Dan. This action echoed the golden calf made by Aaron in the desert, with almost identical words. Jeroboam was not necessarily rejecting the worship of Yahweh, but was creating an alternative way to worship him, violating the second commandment and leading the people away from true devotion. He also instituted new festivals and appointed priests from outside the tribe of Levi, as we read in 1 Kings 12 verses 32 to 33. These religious innovations came to define the northern kingdom. Subsequent kings continued on this path of corrupted worship. The Bible repeatedly states that they followed the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat and did not turn away from them. As generations passed, things worsened. Kings like Ahab and Jezebel introduced the worship of Baal and Asherah, Canaanite fertility deities. Pagan altars, Asherah poles, and high places spread throughout the land. Although the name of Yahweh was still used, his worship had been deeply corrupted by idolatry. But God did not abandon his people without warning. For nearly 2 centuries, he sent prophets to the northern kingdom, men like Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea. They confronted kings, challenged false priests, and called the people to repentance. Through Hosea, God lamented, "My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge," Hosea 4 verse 6, and warned, "They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind," Hosea 8 verse 7. Since the 9th century BC, Assyria had been expanding its power, conquering neighboring nations with a brutal and efficient army. Under King Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 to 727 BC, the Assyrians began to pressure Israel, demanding heavy tributes. Hoshea, the last king of Israel, attempted a dangerous strategy. While feigning loyalty to Assyria, he secretly sought help from Egypt. When Tiglath-Pileser died and was succeeded by Shalmaneser V, Hoshea stopped paying tribute, hoping that the leadership change would provide a chance for independence. It was a fatal mistake. In 2 Kings 17 verses 4 to 5, we read that the king of Assyria discovered Hoshea's treachery, imprisoned him, and invaded the entire land, laying siege to Samaria for 3 years. The siege was long and terrible. Famine and disease devastated the population trapped within the city's walls. Finally, in 722 BC, the city fell into the hands of a new Assyrian king, Sargon II. The Bible describes the event concisely yet powerfully. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria, 2 Kings 17 verse 6. The Assyrians were notorious for their cruelty. Amid the painful experience of exile came the consequences of unfaithfulness to Yahweh and the blending with pagan practices. Determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past, some Samaritans, possibly the most devoted to Yahweh and least attached to pagan customs, viewed the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem as an opportunity for reconciliation. In Ezra 4 verses 1 to 3, we read of this attempt. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of Israel's families answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." This passage is revealing in several ways. First, it shows that the Samaritans considered themselves legitimate worshippers of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Second, they acknowledged their origins in the Assyrian resettlement policy since the time of Esarhaddon king of Assyria, who brought us here. Third, the response from Zerubbabel and Jeshua reflects a categorical rejection by the Jews. "You have no part with us." This rejection became a defining moment in the relationship between Jews and Samaritans. The Jews viewed the Samaritans as an impure people, of mixed blood and corrupted religion. They did not accept the Samaritans as having any legitimate part in the worship of Yahweh or in the legacy of Israel. The Samaritans responded with opposition to the rebuilding effort. In Ezra 4 verses 4-5, we read, "Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus king of Persia and down to the reign of Darius king of Persia." Later, when Nehemiah led the reconstruction of Jerusalem's walls, he faced particularly fierce opposition from Sanballat the Horonite, who appears to have been a Samaritan leader. In Nehemiah 4 verses 1-2, it says, "When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, 'What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble? Burned as they are, rejected by the Jews, and deeply resentful, the Samaritans decided to build their own temple. Around 432 BC, under the leadership of Sanballat, or possibly one of his descendants, they established a sanctuary on Mount Gerizim near the ancient city of Shechem. The choice of location was no coincidence. According to Deuteronomy 11 verse 29 and 27:12, Mount Gerizim was the mountain of blessing, where 6 tribes of Israel were to stand and proclaim the blessings of the covenant upon entering the promised land. Joshua 8 verse 33 confirms this ceremony. All Israel, foreigners and natives alike, with the elders, officials, and judges, were standing on both sides of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. Half of the people stood in front of Mount Gerizim and half in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had formerly commanded when he gave instructions to bless the people of Israel. This connection to such a significant moment in Israel's history gave Mount Gerizim special importance. Additionally, according to Samaritan tradition, Abraham brought Isaac to Mount Gerizim to be sacrificed, in contrast to the Jewish tradition, which places this event on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. They also believed that Jacob had his dream of the ladder to heaven on Mount Gerizim, whereas Jewish tradition places that event in Bethel. In Samaritan understanding, Mount Gerizim was the true location chosen by God for his sanctuary. They believed it was Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem, that was the legitimate place of worship. To reinforce this position, the Samaritans adopted only the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, as their sacred scripture. They rejected the prophetic and historical books that validated Jerusalem and the Davidic lineage. Their version of the Pentateuch contains significant differences from the Jewish Masoretic text. Most notably, in their version of Deuteronomy 27 verse 4, where the Jewish text refers to Mount Ebal as the place to build an altar, the Samaritan version names Mount Gerizim instead. For the Samaritans, this was textual proof that their holy mountain had been chosen by God from the beginning. They also established their own priestly lineage, independent of the Jerusalem priesthood. Although they claimed descent from Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, the Jews disputed this genealogy, considering it fabricated. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus offers a negative view of the Samaritan temple's origins, claiming it was built as a refuge for dissident Jews who wanted to escape Nehemiah's strict reforms. Manasseh, brother of the high priest Jaddua, had married Sanballat's daughter and was expelled by Nehemiah. Sanballat promised not only to preserve his son-in-law's priestly position, but also to make him governor and to build a temple on Mount Gerizim similar to the one in Jerusalem. Whatever the exact truth about its founding, the construction of the temple on Mount Gerizim marked the definitive schism between Jews and Samaritans. From that point forward, there were 2 peoples claiming to be the true Israel, 2 temples claiming to be the rightful place to worship Yahweh, and 2 competing interpretations of the law of Moses. Foreign influences during and after the Babylonian exile in the 4th century BC drastically changed the world around both Jews and Samaritans. With the conquests of Alexander the Great, Greek culture and lifestyle began to spread throughout the Middle East. After Alexander's death, his generals divided the empire. The region of Judea and Samaria passed from Egyptian, Ptolemaic control to Syrian, Seleucid control. Tensions between Jews and Samaritans increased when some Jews, during this period of Hellenism, began adopting Greek customs. The Samaritans used this as evidence that the Jews were willing to compromise their faith, while presenting themselves as the true guardians of the ancient Israelite tradition. However, the Samaritans were not immune to Hellenistic influence either. When Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, tried to enforce Hellenism by force in 167 BC, some Samaritans apparently went along with the new policies. According to 2 Maccabees 6:1-2, the Samaritans even offered to dedicate their temple on Mount Gerizim to Zeus Hellenios, which only reinforced the Jewish view that the Samaritans were easily swayed and inferior in their devotion to Yahweh. Hostilities between the two groups escalated to such a point that, at some time during this period, direct travel between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south became dangerous due to the hostile territory of Samaria lying between them. Jews traveling to Jerusalem for festivals often chose a longer route through the Jordan Valley to the east to avoid potentially violent encounters with the Samaritans. Religious and ethnic tensions between Jews and Samaritans erupted into open conflict during the Maccabean period. The Maccabean Revolt, which began in 167 BC as a Jewish uprising against the forced imposition of Hellenism by the Seleucid Empire, eventually led to the establishment of an independent Jewish kingdom under the Hasmonean dynasty. After the death of Simon Maccabeus, his son John Hyrcanus became high priest and ruler, 135 to 104 BC. Under his leadership, the new Jewish state expanded its borders through a series of military conquests. The Hasmoneans were motivated not only by territorial ambitions, but also by a desire to purify the land of Israel from foreign influences and those they deemed corrupted. In 128 BC, John Hyrcanus turned his attention to Samaria. His forces first captured the city of Shechem at the foot of Mount Gerizim and then advanced to the Samaritans' sacred mountain. There, in an act of profound religious and political significance, they completely destroyed the Samaritan temple. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in his work Antiquities of the Jews, reports that John Hyrcanus not only demolished the temple, but also razed the city that had developed around it. For the Samaritans, this was not merely a military defeat, but a religious catastrophe. Their sacred center, equivalent to Jerusalem for the Jews, had been desecrated and destroyed. This deliberate destruction was more than an act of war. It was a calculated blow to the religious legitimacy of the Samaritans. For John Hyrcanus and the Jews, there was only one legitimate temple, the one in Jerusalem. The Samaritan temple was seen as a symbol of heresy and rebellion against the true worship of Yahweh, and its destruction was regarded as an act of religious purification. After the conquest, John Hyrcanus imposed Jewish practices on the Samaritans, including forced circumcision and obedience to Jewish laws as interpreted by the Pharisees. This coercive imposition of religion only deepened the hatred between the two peoples. To the Samaritans, this was not a genuine conversion, but religious tyranny. The destruction of Samaritan cities continued. Josephus reports that, a few years later, Alexander Jannaeus, son of John Hyrcanus and his successor as ruler, also attacked and destroyed the city of Samaria, the ancient capital of the northern kingdom. Despite the destruction of their temple, the Samaritans continued to consider Mount Gerizim their sacred site. Without a formal temple, they maintained their religious practices as best they could, worshiping at the location where the sanctuary once stood. The physical destruction of the temple did not erase their conviction that Mount Gerizim was the true place chosen by God for worship. In fact, the Hasmonean persecution may have strengthened Samaritan identity rather than destroyed it. They now saw themselves not only as guardians of the true Mosaic faith, but also as martyrs suffering for their loyalty to the faith. The trauma of their temple's destruction sank deep into the Samaritan collective memory, just as the destruction of the first temple had marked the Jewish consciousness. This traumatic event remained alive in Samaritan memory for generations. The violence of John Hyrcanus against the Samaritan sanctuary cemented the hostility between the two peoples, creating a schism that seemed impossible to overcome. The independence of the Hasmonean kingdom would not last long. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey, taking advantage of a civil war between rival Hasmonean claimants to the throne, intervened in the region. Jerusalem was besieged and captured, and Judea became a client state of Rome. With this conquest, both Jews and Samaritans lost their independence and came under foreign occupation. Roman rule brought relative political stability, but also new challenges for the traditional religious communities of the region. For the Samaritans, Roman rule offered some relief from Hasmonean oppression. The Romans tended to respect local cults, as long as they did not disturb the Pax Romana or interfere with tax collection. Although the Romans did not allow the reconstruction of the temple on Mount Gerizim, the Samaritans were at least able to practice their religion without the active persecution they had faced under the Hasmoneans. The Romans, with their pragmatic approach to governance, recognized Jews and Samaritans as distinct groups, each with their own religious traditions. This meant that the Samaritans had some legal protection and official recognition, even though they continued to be despised by the Jews. However, living under the same imperial power only solidified the social separation between the two groups. Isolation became complete. Jews avoided any contact with Samaritans, considering them ritually unclean. Touching an object a Samaritan had touched, eating food prepared by Samaritan hands, or even drinking water from a Samaritan well, all were seen as acts of contamination. The term Samaritan became an insult among the Jews, synonymous with impurity and religious betrayal. In heated debates, calling someone a Samaritan was a grave offense. This is reflected in the Gospel of John 8, verse 48, when Jesus' opponents say to him,